Welcome to CPAC Today in Politics. Coming up, the Bank of Canada will receive a renewed mandate today.
There was lots of talk that, it might actually be given a dual mandate, which is to, tamp down inflation, but, also to be careful about trying to, create full employment. So a dual mandate, but that's not likely to happen. It's likely to be a tweaked mandate.
What should we expect in tomorrow's economic update?
Now with this fall economic update, Trudeau seems to want to add more to the problem by spending uncontrolled sums on things we don't need at great expense to the Canadian people.
And the government deals with a COVID relief package and the Omicron variant as we head into the last week of Parliament before the Christmas break.
The first thing that I would say for anyone who's watching and even the opposition is that if they want to help us to make sure that we have the tools to foster economic growth, to protect Canadian and businesses across the country, is to approve pending the Bill C2, which is pending in the House. That would be the first thing to make sure that we have the right authority to approve these programs.
It's Monday, December 13th. I'm Mark Sutcliffe. Let's get right to the top political stories this morning. I'm joined by Peter Van Dusen, CPAC's executive producer and the host of Primetime Politics. Good morning, Peter.
Morning, Mark.
So we're going to hear from the government today on the mandate for the Bank of Canada. There's been so much talk about inflation in the last few months. The Conservatives, the official opposition, have been asking a lot of questions about it. They've been using the term just inflation, and many people have been pointing out it's not up to the government to control inflation. It's up to the Bank of Canada, but it is up to the government to set the mandate for the Bank of Canada. So what's happening today and what do you expect?
That's right, Mark. Every 5 years, the central bank's mandate to deal with, monetary policy, to deal with, inflation risks, and so on, money supply, is renewed, and so that comes up before the end of this year. So it'll be renewed, but there was lots of talk that, it might actually be given a dual mandate, which is to, tamp down inflation, but, also to be careful about trying to, create full employment. So a dual mandate. But that's not likely to happen. It's likely to be a tweaked mandate where the inflation target is still between 1% and 3%, so typically hovers around 2%, but we know inflation's at an 18-year record high, nudging up against 5%. So a lot of people concerned that, the bank needs to start, moving on interest rates to try and tamp down demand, try and wrestle inflation down somewhat. But I think, what we're likely to see instead is a holding the inflation target at 2% and taking into consideration impacts of interest rate changes and so on, and managing the economy and interest rates with a view to ensuring that employment is stable and continues to grow. So a lot of people also point out that all of that, while maybe it's not part of the official mandate in terms of the notion of a dual mandate, all of those decisions are now factored in, especially in the last couple of years of the pandemic. They're all factored into the decisions the bank makes now anyway. It's conscious of what's happening with employment. It isn't just single-mindedly looking at an interest rate, an inflation rate of 2% and at the expense of everything else. It's been considering all of those other factors in the last couple of years. So it'll be a tweak of the mandate, but not a complete makeover of the mandate in the sense of making it into a dual mandate. It'll still be a focus on inflation with consideration for employment.
All right. And then tomorrow, in what's shaping up to be a big week with regard to economic issues, we're going to get a fiscal update from the Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland. What are you hearing about that?
They've typically, fiscal updates, pre-pandemic, had essentially become mini budgets. There's supposed to be an opportunity at the sort of waypoint, sort of between budgets for a government to come out and say, okay, here's sort of where we are in our predictions. Here's what the fiscal picture looks like. Here's what the deficit's shape. Here's how we're doing with the deficit. Here's what the debt looks like. Here's how our spending has been so far. And we're right on track or we're a bit off track as we head towards the next budget. And, what they've become is, in effect, for a number of years, mini budgets. we get whole policy announcements and fiscal updates and more spending. The indications are it's not going to be that elaborate this time, that it's going to be more of a traditional fiscal update, which focuses on the numbers, with lots of language around a government that is, is being transparent, is focused on the needs of Canadians, is fully aware of the challenges on affordability issues, including inflation and housing. So we'll hear lots of talk in the fiscal update about how the government's aware of what's happening, and it'll talk again about the child care, $10 a day child care, its plans unveiled during the election campaign to deal with housing costs and so on, and cut down on foreign speculation that pushes up housing prices. But in terms of great, big spending plans and big allocations of new money, I don't think we're going to see that. I'd be very surprised if we did. I think instead, the questions people are going to be asking about the fiscal update when we see it are going to be questions around is the government going to push ahead full steam given the challenge of inflation? And lots of experts suggest that pouring money into the economy can push along inflation. Is it as some would suggest, is it the main cause of higher inflation? A lot of experts would dispute that.
Yeah.
But the higher oil prices over the last year have probably created a windfall for the government, somewhere in the area of about $10 billion. Are they going to talk about spending that money, or are they going to talk about putting that perhaps against the deficit? And so I'm watching to see what they do if they've got a windfall, what they say about increased or different spending, what they say about any plans to tackle inflation, how quickly they push ahead with affordability issues like housing, and whether there is anywhere in this fiscal update any discussion around a date for returning to a balanced budget.
Yeah. And on that, Peter, and more broadly, just on the state of the economy, how worried do you think Chrystia Freeland is, the Prime Minister is, the people in the Prime Minister's office about economic issues? We've just been through almost 2 years of a pandemic with extraordinary levels of spending, huge deficits, and now there is this risk of inflation. And we know that often, whether it's the government's fault or not, economic issues are what can bring a government down. So do you think this is an area of deep concern at the moment?
Sure, I think it's an area of deep concern because over time, right now the narrative is bogged down around who's responsible for inflation. The Conservatives say it's the government spending, reckless spending that's driving up inflation. The government says, look, this is a global problem. We're coming out of the pandemic. Economies are starting to recover. There's pent up demand. There's supply chain problems. All of these external factors are driving up inflation. But it's not exclusively those things. Government spending can push up inflation. So they're conscious of how a narrative that reflects badly on them over time, could be political cost. Could be costly politically if they don't find a way to put some measures forward and move forward on their plans to deal with affordability. They can point to lots of outside experts and sources that say, look, we're going to run up against high inflation, lots of expectation that that will start to get tamped down in New Year at some point, probably no later than late spring, early summer, when the Bank of Canada would probably look at having to push up interest rates again. That'll start to tamp down some of the demand. But the big question mark in all this, Mark, is what's the role of government? Have we decided yet when a government, federally or provincially, gets to step back from spending on the pandemic? Massive billions and billions of dollars of spending we've seen in the last couple of years, but now there's the variant. And so even as much as Chrystia Freeland's talk about, the final package of supports for Canadians, who knows where we're going to be a month from now? Maybe it's not the final package, and maybe governments are going to have to step back in with plans about supports and spending if things start to go sideways with this variant.
Yeah, and just on that, what do you expect over the final few days of Parliament? It's the last week that Parliament is scheduled to sit before the Christmas break, which will stretch till the end of January. What do you expect to be the focus of the government with regard to this new variant and relief for Canadians, support for Canadians? Because obviously there are steps the government can take even when Parliament's not sitting, but this is the last week that it'll be discussed in the House.
Yeah, I think, and there's given the priorities the government said it had for the 4-week sitting, I think you have to look at this reasonably and say, a fair bit's been accomplished in a short amount of time. And maybe that's a message for what else can happen when Parliament does reconvene in the new year. But the government, got 3 of its priority pieces three of the 4 measures it said it needed to get through. It's gotten through. The last piece is this what ostensibly is supposed to be the final COVID relief package that's been at committee and comes back to the House. Probably finished out of that committee tonight and back in the House in the next couple of days to be dealt with. And if that happens, then that COVID package is pushed through, and Parliament's done its work before it goes away for the winter break. The question is, as you point out, lots of things could happen even though parliamentarians aren't sitting. And the number one focus once they go away is going to be what's happening with Omicron and the variant, and whether the government has to start talking again about even deeper travel restrictions, whether, as we see some spread in the provinces, do they, nobody wants to hear the L word again, but does the lockdown word come up again? And our government's then pressed to have to step in and do some of the things we saw them doing, at the outset of the pandemic in terms of relief programs and support programs. Nobody wants to go there. Nobody wants to see that. But who knows where this is headed, and governments will be on duty and on guard and perhaps pressed into action again with some of these programs if things get bad.
Yeah. All right. It's going to be a busy week heading towards the finish line later this week. Peter, thank you so much for breaking it down for us.
All right, Mark. Take care, and we'll talk again soon.
That's CPAC's Peter Van Dusen. Now, here's what political columnists and commentators are writing about today. In the Toronto Star, Robin Sears argues it's time for political leaders to tackle the hard issues in Canadian healthcare. Sears writes, as we pray that we begin to see the light at the end of the pandemic tunnel, there is no more important Build Back Better challenge than transforming healthcare. Yes, it will cost more money, and yes, the struggle over who pays for what will be a typically Canadian federal-provincial bun fight. But now is the time for today's leaders to create a stronger, more connected, more resilient, and innovative Canadian healthcare system for a new generation. In an editorial, the Toronto Sun argues, the kids are not all right. The Sun writes, while we may not know with certainty for quite some time whether lockdowns caused more harm than they prevented for the general population, we believe it's reasonable to conclude that when it comes to kids, there is no denying that the harms outweighed the good. This isn't just about Canadian kids, it's about kids around the world. And a flagship report from UNICEF should serve as a wake-up call to just how damaged many millions of kids have been due to COVID-19 and our responses to it. In Maclean's, Philippe J. Fournier considers the free fall of Quebec's Liberals. Fournier writes, having its right-of-center and business-savvy flank eroded by the CAQ and without the threat of separation on the near horizon, the Quebec Liberal Party's very raison d'être has become a blur and has driven them into an existential crisis. A greener and more progressive platform may be an attempt to attract soft federalist voters, but they would mostly be urban voters. Seat-wise, this would not help the Quebec Liberal Party grow beyond its loyal Montreal base. Without stronger numbers in rural Quebec, the party could soon suffer its worst electoral defeat since Confederation. Now, here's what's coming up on today's political agenda. The Prime Minister will be joined by Minister of Families Karina Gould for an early learning and childcare announcement in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs Dominic LeBlanc and Minister of Official Languages Jeanette Petitpas-Taylor will join virtually from Moncton, New Brunswick. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland will hold a joint news conference with the Governor of the Bank of Canada. Defence Minister Anita Anand will deliver an apology on behalf of the government to all current and former members of Canada's defence team who have been affected by sexual assault, sexual harassment, or discrimination based on sex, gender identity, or sexual orientation. International Trade Minister Mary Ng will be joined by Minister for Women Marcy Ian to make an announcement about the Black Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. The Senate Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology will hear from Labour Minister Seamus O'Regan. And the Chief Public Health Officer of Canada will hold a news conference following the table of her annual report. And that's CPAC Today in Politics for Monday, December 13th. Tune into Primetime Politics tonight on CPAC for coverage of all the day's events. Our podcast returns tomorrow morning. Have a great day.